The council chamber on Vera Station smelled like something burning, but it always did. The Velthari delegation liked their air processes set to a temperature that scorched the inside of a human nose, and the station staff had long since stopped adjusting it. Small comforts were not on offer here. Diplomacy at the 62nd session of the Galactic Accord was not a comfortable business. Admiral Grace Owens sat in the fourth row of the human delegation box and kept her face very still. She was 51 years old. She had gray in her hair that she had never once considered hiding. She wore her dress uniform because the occasion required it, not because she enjoyed the collar, which was tight and formal and scratched the left side of her neck in a way she had learned to ignore over 20 years of wearing it. She sat with her hands folded on the small desk in front of her and watched the floor of the chamber below, where High Chancellor Vorasan of the Velthari Empire was finishing a speech that had been going on for the better part of 40 minutes. The speech was, nominally, about trade route redistribution in the outer reaches. It was actually about something else. Grace had understood that from the first 10 minutes. The trade route discussion was the wrapping. What was inside the wrapping became clear around the 20-minute mark, when Vorasan turned from the podium and looked directly at the human delegation box. He had 4 eyes, 2 large forward-facing ones, pale gold and expressionless, and 2 smaller ones set higher on his skull that could rotate independently. The smaller ones were pointed at the humans now. The larger ones were still aimed at the full chamber, performing for the audience, but the small ones were doing something different. They were measuring, he said, in the trade tongue that all Accord members were required to learn. We must, of course, also consider the contributions of our newer members to the stability of the trade network. Some civilizations bring great resources. Some bring great knowledge. Some bring great military capacity. He paused. The pause was theatrical, perfectly timed. And some bring a pleasant enthusiasm that we find, if I may say, quite charming in its simplicity. Laughter moved through the chamber. Not loud laughter, not the kind that rolled and echoed. It was the quiet, contained, knowing laughter of political bodies, the kind that says we all understand what has just been said without anyone having to say it plainly. The quorum delegates in the upper gallery shifted in their seats. A few looked away. One, a tall, blue-skinned female from the Sethra Collective, did not laugh and did not look away. She was watching the human box with an expression Grace could not quite read. Senator Paul Whitman, seated directly to Grace's left, made a small sound in his throat. He was younger than Grace by 6 years and had a face that showed emotion more readily than she had ever allowed her own face to show. His jaw had tightened. His hands were flat on his desk. Grace did not look at him. She did not need to. She knew what he was feeling because she had felt it herself 11 years ago at the 41st session, when a Velthari trade minister had made a similar joke, slightly less refined, with slightly less laughter but more open contempt. She had made a note in her personal log that night, too. What she wrote now, in the small leather notebook she carried to every session, was, still underestimating. 31 years, and they are still doing it. She underlined the last 4 words once, capped her pen, and put it away. The speech ended. The applause was polite and distributed evenly, which in Accord politics meant no one was offended and no one was impressed. The session broke for the midday interval, and the delegations filtered out into the wide corridor that circled the chamber. Grace walked with Paul, and behind them walked their 2 aides, and none of them spoke until they had turned 2 corners and left the main corridor for the smaller service hallway that ran parallel to it, which was not monitored by the station's public recording systems. That was pointed, Paul said. It was a test, Grace said. A test of what? Whether we'd respond. Whether we'd object formally. Whether we'd request a point of procedure. She watched the corridor ahead. They want to know how we react to pressure that hasn't quite crossed the line yet. They've been doing this for 2 years now, each session a little sharper than the last. They are calibrating. Paul was quiet for a moment. His footsteps were even and measured, a habit he had picked up from years of working in buildings where sound carried. And what did we give them today? Nothing, Grace said. Same as always. Which is exactly right. He nodded slowly. He had been in politics long enough to understand that sometimes the hardest thing to do was also the most important, and that doing nothing on purpose looked identical from the outside to doing nothing because you had no options. The Velthari could not tell the difference. That was the point. That had always been the point. What had begun 31 years ago as a cautious policy decision by a group of Earth's senior military and diplomatic leadership had, over 3 decades, become something more deliberate and more complete than any of its original architects had imagined. The policy had a name inside the Earth Defense Force that was never written in any official document: the Long Quiet. It was simple in concept and staggering in its discipline. Humanity would join the Accord. Humanity would be cooperative, generous, and present at every table. And humanity would show the galaxy exactly as much of itself as served the purpose of looking small. Not weak. Small. There was a difference, and the difference mattered enormously. Weakness invited pity and occasionally charity. Smallness invited the specific kind of comfortable dismissal that left a civilization alone to do its work without interference. The wake, in this case, was not farming or medical research or the building of schools on colonial worlds, though humanity did all of those things genuinely and well. The work that happened out of sight, in the dark space between stars, in facilities buried under mountains and inside hollowed-out asteroids, in research divisions that did not appear in any public budget. That work was of a different kind entirely. Grace had spent the better part of her adult life managing the gap between what the galaxy believed about humanity and what was actually true. It was not always comfortable work. There were sessions like today's where she had to sit very still and let the laughter wash over her and remind herself that the laughter was not failure. The laughter was a strategy working exactly as intended. What concerned her was not the laughter. What concerned her was the timeline. Because the calibration that Vorithsan was performing was not an academic exercise. Civilizations did not spend 2 years testing a smaller neighbor's patience out of intellectual curiosity. They did it because they were preparing to do something, and they wanted to know how their target would respond. She had flagged this pattern in her reports to Earth Defense Command 8 months ago. The response had been 2 words: "We know." She trusted that response because she knew who had written it. She trusted the people at the other end of that channel the way you trusted engineers when they told you the bridge would hold, not on faith, but on 30 years of watching them build things that held. The message from the Velthari Empire arrived at Earth's primary diplomatic relay station on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the 62nd session. It came in the standard Accord diplomatic packet format, properly coded and properly signed, routed through the official channels with all the correct protocols observed. It was, in form, a perfectly ordinary piece of interstellar correspondence. In content, it was a declaration of intent dressed in the language of legal process. The Velthari Empire, the message explained, had filed a territorial dispute claim under Article 9 of the Accord Charter 17 years ago. This claim had been entered into the official record, as required, and had remained pending while the Accord's arbitration process evaluated the relevant historical documentation. After 17 years of deliberation, the Velthari Legal Office had determined that the claim was now ready for resolution. The resolution, they proposed, was straightforward. 8 human colonial systems, the cluster known as the Kepler frontier, which sat between the edges of Velthari space and the mineral-rich territory of the outer reaches, would be transferred to Velthari administrative control. The 400,000 human colonists currently residing in those systems were to be offered resettlement assistance. They had 30 days to begin the process of leaving. The message used the word offered 4 times in describing the resettlement terms. It used the word generous twice. It did not use the words or else, but it did note, in a final paragraph that Grace read 3 times, that a Velthari fleet had been dispatched to the Kepler frontier to facilitate the orderly transition of administrative authority and ensure the safety of the relocating civilian population. Senator Paul Whitman read the message in his office in Geneva with a cup of coffee that went cold while he was reading. He set the message down. He picked it up and read it again. Then he called Grace Owens. She picked up on the second signal. She was already at her desk at Earth Defense Command, which meant she had already been briefed, which meant the Defense Intelligence Network had flagged the message before it reached the diplomatic channels. "How long have they been planning this?" Paul asked. "The Article 9 claim was real," Grace said. "They filed it 17 years ago, just like they said. knowing it would sit in arbitration indefinitely because the supporting documentation was technically insufficient but not clearly fraudulent. It was always a placeholder, a legal peg they could hang something on later. Later being now. Later being now, she agreed. Paul leaned back in his chair. Through the window behind his desk, Geneva was doing what Geneva did in early spring. Gray sky, thin rain, the lake in the distance holding its color against the weather. He had grown up in Ohio, and Geneva still felt foreign to him after 9 years, but he had learned to find a certain steadiness in the view. Right now, the steadiness was not coming easily. They're not actually planning to let those colonists leave. 400,000 people in 30 days is not a realistic timeline for orderly relocation. No, Grace said. It is not. So the 30 days is theater. The 30 days is justification. When the evacuation is incomplete, and it will be incomplete because it is designed to be incomplete, they will have ground to declare the civilian population as evidence of territorial noncompliance and move to secure the systems by force. The colonists become the reason instead of the obstacle. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who was thinking carefully before they said the thing that was already clear to both of them. Can we evacuate them? Paul asked. Genuinely, if we started now, could we do it in 30 days? No, Grace said. Not without stripping every other transportation resource we have. And even then the logistics would make it nearly impossible. They know the numbers. They calculated this. Then we can't comply. No. Which means in 30 days, or less, we will have a Velthari fleet sitting on top of 8 of our colonial systems with 400,000 civilians inside. Yes. Paul was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into the register he used in closed sessions. Measured, direct, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. Grace, tell me what I need to know. She had been waiting for that question. She had been waiting for it for a long time, in the way that people who carry large secrets wait for the moment when the secret becomes relevant. Not with impatience, but with a kind of readiness, everything checked and in its place. Come to the command facility, she said. Not a video call. In person. Bring no aids. He arrived 4 hours later. The Earth Defense Command Facility in the Colorado Mountains was, on the surface, an unremarkable installation. It had a fence. It had a gate. It had guards who were professionally courteous and operationally unreadable. The buildings visible from the access road were functional and dull, the kind of architecture that said nothing interesting happens here by virtue of how genuinely uninteresting it appeared. Paul had been to the facility twice before in his 9 years as a senator. Both times, he had been escorted to a conference room on the second floor of the main building, briefed on standard defense budget allocations, and sent home with a folder of materials that were classified at a level he was cleared to access and contained nothing that genuinely surprised him. This time, Grace met him at the gate personally and walked him to an elevator he had not known existed. They went down. The elevator descended for what felt like considerably longer than the distance to any basement should take. When the doors opened, Paul stepped into a corridor lit with pale blue overhead panels, wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, with a ceiling high enough that he had to look up twice to confirm what he was seeing. This was not a converted basement. This was something that had been built deliberately and maintained over a very long time. The floor was smooth. The air was cool and tasted faintly of recycled ozone. People moved past them in small groups, all in uniform, none of them glancing at Paul with anything other than the brief, professional acknowledgement of someone who knew a cleared civilian was present and had no strong feelings about it. How long has this been here? Paul asked. 27 years, Grace said. She was walking at an even pace beside him, not hurrying, not making the space feel dramatic. She had probably walked this corridor several thousand times. This is one of 6 primary command facilities. There are 14 secondary installations. All of them predate my tenure here by at least 8 years. Paul absorbed that. He had spent 9 years on the Defense Appropriations Committee. He had reviewed budgets, queried line items, cross-referenced expenditures. He thought he had a reasonable picture of what Earth spent on its military. He was beginning to understand that the picture he had was the one he was meant to have. Grace brought him into a room that was called, On its door placard, Analysis Suite 7. Inside was a large display table and a dozen chairs and nobody else. She waited until the door sealed behind them before she spoke. "I'm going to tell you things that will change how you understand the last 30 years, she said. "I'm going to tell you all of it because you need to know all of it to do your job in the next 30 days. Some of what I tell you will be uncomfortable. Some of it you may feel should have been shared with you sooner. I would ask you to hold that reaction until the end." Paul sat down. "Go ahead," she told him. It took 3 hours. When she finished, Paul sat without speaking for a while. On the display table in front of him, the numbers and diagrams she had walked him through were still visible. Fleet positions, platform counts, energy output ratings, a map of the Kepler frontier overlaid with markers that showed things that were not on any public map of the region. He looked at the numbers again, because looking at them helped make them feel real rather than abstract. "We have been doing this," he said finally, "since before I was in office." "Since before your predecessor was in office," Grace said. "The original authorization came from the unification government. It was classified at the highest level and renewed every 8 years by each successive administration. And the Accord members don't know. No, the design principle was always concealment through absence of signal. We did not disguise our capabilities. We removed them from any environment where they could be detected. A ship that emits no power signature, that does not communicate, that does not move, a ship sitting dark in the shadow of a gas giant for 4 years, does not appear in any sensor sweep as a threat. It does not appear at all." "How many ships?" Paul asked. 9 strategic fleets. 904 warships at current count, not including support and logistics vessels. The room was very quiet, and in the Kepler frontier specifically. Paul asked. 312 autonomous defense platforms deployed over an 11-year period. They were placed during routine survey missions that the Velthari monitored and found completely uninteresting because survey ships are common and unglamorous. Grace paused. "The platforms have been inactive since placement. No power, no signal. They look, at any resolution of sensor sweep, like debris." "Until they don't," Paul said. "Until they don't," Grace agreed. He sat with that for another long moment. Then he said something Grace had not expected, which was, "Were you afraid they would do this?" She looked at him steadily. "I was not afraid they would. I was watching to see when they would. There is a difference. You were certain they'd move against us eventually. I was certain that a civilization which uses economic pressure and legal ambiguity to absorb 19 smaller neighbors over 4 centuries does not change its nature because a new neighbor smiles at diplomatic receptions and sends agricultural shipments to famine worlds. Behavior changes when incentives change. Our goal was to change the incentive structure in a way they could not detect until it was too late to adjust their approach." Paul looked at the map on the display table, at the 8 Kepler systems, at the 400,000 small markers that represented people who were, at this moment, going about their lives on colonial worlds they had built over decades, farming, teaching, running small businesses, raising children in homes that smelled like the local soil and the specific quality of light that each world's sun produced. "And those people," he said, "the colonists, do they know any of this? No. They're going to be in the middle of it. They're going to be the reason it ends quickly," Grace said. "The Velthari fleet will arrive expecting nothing. What they will find instead will produce, I expect, a very fast reassessment of their operational assumptions." She looked at Paul with the same steadiness she had held throughout the 3 hours of briefing. "I will not allow those colonists to be harmed. That is not a policy position. It is a personal commitment. And every system we have built in the Kepler frontier exists to make that commitment keepable." Paul nodded. He stood up. He looked at the map one more time and then looked away from it, because looking at it too long started to feel like trying to hold something very large in both hands, and he needed to be practical right now. "What do you need from me?" "Stay visible. Do your job on the Senate floor exactly as you always have. Do not change your schedule. Do not cancel your public engagements. If the Velthari are watching our government's behavior, and they are, they need to see no signal of alarm. And the 30-day deadline. Let it run," Grace said. Every day the deadline runs is a day the Velthari fleet is committed to a course of action built on information that is wrong. Do not correct their information. Paul almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a person who has just understood a chess position they thought was simple and found it to be something else entirely. You've been waiting for them to make this move. I have been ready for them to make it, Grace said. Those are not the same thing. I did not want this. I built for it because wanting and preparing are not the same thing either. He left. The elevator took him back up to the world of thin spring rain and the lake holding its color in the distance. And he drove back to Geneva and attended 3 meetings that afternoon and said nothing at any of them that deviated from his normal pattern, because Grace had told him what was needed and he was very good at doing what was needed. The Velthari war fleet crossed into Kepler frontier space on the 29th day. 1 day early. They had set their own deadline and then moved before it, because that was what they had decided to do, to arrive while evacuation was still technically in progress, while the colonist was still present, so that the colonist became the legal justification rather than an impediment to it. It was a neat piece of legal maneuvering, the kind that Velthari diplomatic lawyers had refined over 4 centuries of doing exactly this kind of thing to exactly this kind of neighbor. Fleet Marshal Dorvac Hen commanded the operation from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Claim, which was the largest dreadnought in the Velthari First Expansion Fleet. He was a careful officer. He had commanded 3 previous territorial integration operations, all of which had proceeded efficiently and without significant resistance, because the civilizations involved had taken one look at his fleet formations and made the sensible calculation that compliance was preferable to the alternative. He expected the same outcome here. The intelligence assessments he had read before departure were thorough and consistent. Earth was a T4 civilization, which in Accord classification meant a species that had achieved interstellar travel and basic colonial expansion, but had not developed significant military-grade technology or large-scale independent fleet capacity. They had patrol vessels. They had orbital platforms on their major worlds. They had, according to every scan his intelligence services had performed over the past decade, a modest defensive capability appropriate to a young civilization that had not yet needed to defend itself against anyone serious. He had 4 to 7 dreadnoughts, 212 cruisers, a support fleet that stretched across 17,000 kilometers of open space. He had brought more than was needed because the political moment required a display that was visually unambiguous, the kind of formation that converted hesitation into compliance without requiring a single weapon to be fired. His fleet entered the Kepler frontier at the standard approach speed for territorial integration operations, fast enough to demonstrate commitment, controlled enough to maintain formation discipline. Commander Dale Hartley was at his station on Kepler 7 station when the first proximity alarm sounded. He was 38 years old. He had brown hair that was getting long enough to need cutting and a habit of drinking his coffee cold because he often forgot about it. He had been stationed at Kepler 7 for 3 years and had found the posting quiet in the way that postings far from Earth tended to be quiet. The kind of quietness that could feel like peace if you let it, and like isolation if you were having a bad week. He was not having a bad week. He was having a very strange morning. The proximity alarm was not unexpected. They had known the fleet was coming for 3 days. The tracking data from the Accord's public navigation network had made the fleet's approach vector obvious to anyone paying attention, and Dale had been paying attention with considerable focus. What he had done with that attention, and with the 3 days of lead time, was exactly what his orders specified. He had checked and double-checked the station systems. He had made sure his crew knew their stations, and he had said nothing to the colonists on the planet below because the orders said to say nothing to the colonists. He trusted the orders. He had read them and reread them, and they had come from a chain of command he had spent his career trusting, and the specific language of the orders was calm and precise in a way that steadied him when the part of his brain that could see 4 to 7 dreadnoughts on his tactical display wanted to do something other than feel steady. "Contact confirmed," said Lieutenant Kevin Marsh from the sensor station. Kevin was 29 and had been Dale's sensor officer for 2 years. He was good at his job in the thorough, quiet way that made a good sensor officer useful rather than flashy. Velthari First Expansion Fleet. 4 to 7 dreadnoughts, 212 cruisers, support fleet following at 60,000 kilometers. Dale looked at the tactical display. The formation was exactly what the intelligence briefings had described. Time to effective range. 41 minutes at current approach speed, sir. Dale nodded. He picked up his cold coffee, drank some of it, set it down. He looked at the 6 patrol vessels on his own tactical display, small green markers that looked exactly as small as they were. He looked at the orbital platforms, which were somewhat larger green markers that were still, compared to what was approaching, very small. He opened the command channel to Earth Defense Command. "Admiral," he said when Grace Owens appeared on the comm screen. "We have contact." They came early. Her face was the same as it always was. That was one of the things Dale had noticed about Grace Owens over the years. Her face in a crisis was indistinguishable from her face in a routine briefing. She held things at the same temperature regardless of what they were. "I know," she said. "Hold your position, Commander. Do not engage. Authorization code is now active. Wake everything up." He had known, in an abstract sense, that an authorization code existed. He had been briefed on its existence during a classified session 14 months ago. The briefing had been short and specific. It had told him that the code existed, what to do when it was transmitted, and that the operational details of what the code activated were classified above his access level. He had been instructed not to think about it more than was necessary and to trust the system. He keyed the code into the command interface. The station's power readings spiked so fast that the monitoring system flagged it as a possible malfunction and generated an automatic error report that Dale would later clear from the log. Kevin Marsh turned from his sensor console. He was a person who did not startle easily and who processed information in an orderly and sequential way. What he was doing at this moment was not that. He was staring at his display with the expression of a person whose orderly processing had run into something that it did not have a category for. "Sir," Kevin said. His voice was very quiet. The deep space sensor arrays just came online. "All of them?" Dale asked. Kevin checked his display. He checked it again. "Yes, sir. All of them. The whole network." He paused. "So, I am reading 312 autonomous platforms in the Kepler Frontier Operational Zone. They were..." He stopped. He looked at the readout. He looked at it a third time. "They have been here, sir. They have been sitting here. The power-up sequence shows they have been in cold dark status for between 4 and 11 years. The bridge was quiet. The crew were at their stations and doing their jobs and not speaking, which was exactly what trained people did. But the silence had a particular quality to it. The quality of people hearing something that was reorganizing their understanding of the situation they were in. "What else?" Dale asked. He kept his voice even. Kevin was still reading. His hands were moving over the console with the focused, mechanical precision of someone who was working very hard to stay inside the numbers. "They are ship signatures, sir. Deep space. They are not on any public registry. I am reading them in the gravitational shadow of Kepler-4's primary gas giant, inside the Hartmann asteroid field, in an open space at coordinates that are..." He stopped again. Dale waited. "Sir, the coordinates are consistent with a long-term cold dark position. These ships have been sitting there for a very long time and we had no idea." "How many?" Dale asked. Kevin looked up. For the first time in 2 years of working together, Dale saw something in Kevin's expression that he could not quite name. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was a kind of profound, quiet amazement, the expression of a person who has just seen the actual size of something they thought they understood. "A great many, sir," Kevin said. "A very significant number." On the bridge of the Eternal Claim, Fleet Marshal Dorvacan was watching his sensor returns with growing unease. The 6 human patrol vessels had not moved. The orbital platforms around Kepler-7 had not powered their weapons. The station had not responded to his final approach warning. All of this was consistent with a T4 civilization that understood its situation and was deciding how to comply. It was the expected behavior. What was not expected was the sensor anomaly his tactical computer had flagged 6 minutes ago and was now flagging again, with increasing urgency. His sensor chief, a veteran officer named Vren who had served in 2 previous integration operations and was not given to excitability, had turned from her console and was looking at Dorvac with an expression he had not seen on her face before. "Marshal," Vren said. Her secondary breathing membranes, the small pleated structures beneath her jaw that opened and closed with her stress response, were moving visibly. She was not controlling them. I am receiving readings that my system is classifying as an error. I have run the diagnostic twice. There is no malfunction. What are the readings? Contacts, Marshall. In the space around Kepler 7. They were not present on our approach scans. They are present now. She paused. A large number of them. And they are not transmitting anything. No threats, no demands, no communications at all. They are simply. She stopped, as if she needed a moment to finish the sentence accurately. They are simply looking at us. Dorvac stayed at the sensor returns. He pulled the raw data himself and read it the way a careful officer read numbers that did not agree with his expectations, looking for the error, looking for the explanation, looking for the thing that would resolve the contradiction. He did not find an error. He did not find an explanation. What he found, when he read the numbers 3 times and they said the same thing each time, was something that his professional assessment of this operation had no category for. Earth was a Tier 4 civilization. Every intelligence assessment said so. Every scan, every observation, every 30 years of watching these people smile and bring food to famine worlds and say please and thank you at diplomatic receptions said so. Every intelligence assessment, he was beginning to understand, had been reading exactly what the humans wanted it to read. Sir, his communications officer, young, controlled, but with something careful around the edges of his voice. We are receiving a transmission from the human station. Text format. No visual. No audio. Dorvac straightened in his command chair. Read it. The officer read it. 2 sentences. The bridge did not make a sound. Outside the viewports, in the dark space around Kepler 7, things that had been invisible for years were becoming visible. One by one and then in clusters, the sensor returns resolved into shapes. Shapes that had mass and dimension. Shapes that had been patient for a very long time. Shapes that were now, for the first time, choosing to be seen. The message had said, "You were warned. Now watch." And so Dorvac Hen watched. And what he saw, in the 90 seconds that followed, changed the calculation of everything he thought he had come here to do. The 90 seconds that followed the message were the longest 90 seconds of Fleet Marshal Dorvac Hen's professional life. He had served the Velthari Empire for 38 years. He had commanded warships in 3 territorial integration operations. He had sat in command chairs during political crises and equipment failures and the kind of slow, grinding logistical emergencies that 8 weeks and resolved with no drama and left the commanding officer older and quieter. He was not a person who was easily shaken. His crew knew this. His superiors knew it. It was one of the reasons he had been chosen for this particular operation, which was supposed to be a display of force so complete that nothing would be required of him but presence. The sensor returns on his tactical display were not consistent with that expectation. They were consistent with something else entirely. In the first 30 seconds after the human message arrived, the contacts around Kepler 7 numbered 41. His sensor chief Ren was reading them aloud in a flat, controlled voice, the voice of a trained officer processing data that her training had not prepared her for. 41 contacts. Then, as the cold dark platforms powered up in sequence, not all at once, not in a panicked rush, but in a deliberate, measured wave that moved through the space around them like a tide coming in, the number rose. 60, 90, 112, 140. By the time 30 seconds had passed, the number was over 200. Dorvac's tactical officer, a young male named Sirek who was doing his job with the focused rigidity of someone who understood that doing his job was the only thing currently standing between him and the reality of the situation, said, "Marshal, the contacts are not moving to engagement positions. They are holding station." "All of them?" Dorvac asked. "All of them, sir. The platforms are online and armed, but they have not targeted any vessel in our fleet." Sirek paused. "They are present. They are not threatening." Dorvac understood the distinction. It was a military distinction, precise and deliberate. A weapon that was present but not aimed said something different from a weapon that was aimed. A weapon that was aimed said, "I am ready to kill you." A weapon that was present but not aimed said something that was, in some ways, harder to receive. It said, "I could kill you, and I am choosing not to, and I want you to sit with that." He sat with it. In the second 30 seconds, the deep space signatures that had been ghost contacts on his sensor returns for the past several minutes resolved into solid readings. Ships. Large ships. The kind of ships that his sensor array recognized by their mass signatures before it had processed their configurations, because mass was the first thing sensors read at distance, and the mass readings were very clear. Sarek's voice had changed. He was still doing his job. He would continue doing his job until ordered otherwise, because that was what he was trained for. But something in the texture of his voice had shifted in a way that Dorvac recognized as the sound of a person recalibrating their understanding of a situation at high speed while simultaneously trying to appear as though no recalibration was occurring. "Ship contacts," Sarek said. "Deep space. Multiple vectors. Marshal, I am reading." He stopped for a moment and checked the number. He checked it again. He said the number. Dorvac said nothing. In the third 30 seconds, the communications officer reported that the ship contacts were also not moving to engagement positions. Like the platforms, they were holding station. The human patrol vessels around Kepler 7 had still not moved. The station had not added any further communication. Everything that humanity had revealed was simply sitting in the dark and being visible in the way that something very large was visible when it stopped choosing not to be. 90 seconds. Dorvac had commanded 3 integration operations. In all 3, the most difficult moment had been the approach, the period before the target civilization accepted the reality of its situation and compliance began. After compliance began, the work was administrative. He had trained himself, over 38 years, to read that transition point correctly, to feel the moment when resistance stopped being a consideration and the practical work could begin. He felt the transition point now. It was just not in the direction he had planned for. "Open a channel to the human station," he said. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. On Kepler 7 station, Commander Dale Hartley received the request for communication and looked at it for a long moment before he relayed it to Earth Defense Command. Grace Owens came back on the command channel inside 4 minutes. "I will take the communication from here, Commander. Keep your crew at their stations. Do not change your formation. Do not adjust the platform status." "Understood," Dale said. "How is your crew doing?" It was an unexpected question. Dale glanced around the bridge. Kevin Marsh was at his sensor console, reading the same numbers he had been reading for the past several minutes with the concentration of a person who had found that concentrating very hard on numbers was helpful when the numbers were extraordinary. The helm officer, a young woman named Carol Sims, was watching her panel with her hands in her lap because there was nothing to do with her hands at the moment, and she was smart enough not to pretend otherwise. The 3 other crew members at their stations were all doing variations of the same thing. Working, waiting, and handling the weight of what they now knew with the quiet discipline of people who had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, even if they had never been told specifically that this kind of moment was what the training was for. "They are doing well," Dale said, and meant it. Grace nodded once. Then she closed the channel to the station and opened the one to the Velthari flagship. Fleet Marshal Dorvac looked at the human admiral on his comm screen and saw, for the first time in this operation, something he had not expected to see in a Tier 4 civilization's military officer: complete composure. Not the stiff, controlled composure of someone holding themselves together under pressure. Not the performed steadiness of someone trying to project confidence they did not feel. The composure of a person who had been here, in this specific conversation, in their own mind, many times before. Who had thought about what they would say and how they would say it, and had arrived at this moment already prepared for it. He had seen that quality in experienced Velthari commanders. He had never expected to see it in a human. "Marshal," she said. Her voice was even and clear and carried no hostility. "I'm Admiral Grace Owens, Earth Defense Force. I think this conversation will be more useful if we are direct with each other. Are you willing to be direct?" Dorvac considered declining on principle. Then he looked at his sensor returns. "Yes," he said. "Good. I want to tell you 3 things, and I want you to listen to all 3 before you respond." She did not wait for his agreement. She had already decided he would listen. "The first thing is this. The Article 9 claim your legal office filed 17 years ago was always a prepared position, not a genuine territorial dispute. We knew it when it was filed. We watched it sit in arbitration, and we did not challenge it because a challenge would have required us to reveal that we had studied your legal strategy in detail, and we did not want to reveal that. Dorvac kept his face still. The secondary membranes under his jaw were doing what they did under stress, and he could not stop them, but he kept his face still. The second thing, Grace continued. You moved one day before your own deadline. You did that because a deadline you imposed but then violated would leave the colonists present in the systems at the moment of your fleet's arrival, which would allow you to classify them as evidence of non-compliance rather than civilians who needed to be protected. We identified that plan 8 months ago. We had analysts examine every variation of your approach timeline, and the early arrival was the most likely scenario because it was the most legally useful. She paused, not for effect, to make sure the information had been received before she continued. I want you to understand that we have been watching this operation come together for 2 years. We know which admirals planned it. We know which council members authorized it. We have the communications. The bridge behind Dorvac was very still. He could feel the stillness without looking at his crew. It was the stillness of people learning something in real time that changed the shape of what they thought they were doing here. The third thing, Grace said. Her voice did not change. It stayed at the same steady temperature. I did not build everything you are currently reading on your sensor displays because I wanted to use it. I want you to believe that. And I want you to believe it not because I'm asking for trust, but because the evidence supports it. We have had this capacity, or parts of it, for over a decade. We have not used it. We have not threatened anyone with it. We have not walked into Accord sessions and put the numbers on a screen and demanded that the chamber treat us differently. We built it, and we kept it dark, because we understood that a civilization which announces what it can do before it needs to is a civilization that is afraid of what it can do. We are not afraid of it. We just never needed it before now. Dorvac was quiet for a moment. His sensor returns were still saying the same things. The contacts were still holding station. Nothing had moved, nothing had targeted his fleet, and the space around Kepler 7 was full of things that could end his command in less time than it had taken him to receive 3 pieces of information. What do you want from this conversation? He asked. Grace leaned forward slightly. I want you to go home. I want you to take your fleet back across the boundary, and I want you to carry back to your government a clear account of what you found here. Not a distorted account, not a minimized account. A clear one. Because the conversation that your government needs to have after today is a conversation they cannot have if they do not understand what actually happened. And the Article 9 claim. File a withdrawal through the Accord Arbitration Office within 30 days, and we will not bring the communications to the council floor. Take longer than 30 days, and we will. She said it the way someone stated a policy, not the way someone made a threat. The difference was in the tone, and the tone was genuine. I'm not interested in humiliating your government, Marshal. Humiliation creates instability, and instability in a civilization the size of yours creates problems for everyone in this part of the galaxy. I am interested in a clear understanding that did not exist before today. A clear understanding, Dorvac repeated, that what you thought about us was wrong, and that being wrong about us was always going to produce this outcome, no matter when you decided to act on it. She sat back. You are a careful officer. You read your intelligence thoroughly. You planned this operation well within the parameters of what your intelligence told you was true. The failure was not in your planning. The failure was in what you were given to plan with. Dorvac looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his sensor returns one more time. Then he said, carefully, how long have your people been doing this? It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a person trying to recalibrate a very large calculation and asking for the one number they still needed. 31 years, Grace said, since the day we joined the Accord. The line closed. Dr. Lena Ferris watched the sensor feed from the Colorado Command Center and did not feel what she had expected to feel. She was 44 years old and had spent 9 years of her life in the Applied Research Division building things that she could not tell anyone she was building. She had missed her sister's wedding because the project had been in a critical phase, and she could not leave the facility, and she could not explain why she could not leave because the facility officially did not exist. She had been at her sister's rehearsal dinner and driven back the same night and worked for 36 hours straight and called her sister from a phone that logged the call as originating in Denver, not in a mountain. She had built the hinge platforms. She had built 4 generations of them. The current generation, which were the ones currently active in the Kepler frontier, could generate a gravitational shear field across a 14,000-kilometer radius. There were 41 of them deployed across human-controlled space. She knew every component, every tolerance, every failure mode, every simulation result. She had spent more hours thinking about these machines than she had spent thinking about almost any other thing in her life. She had always assumed that when the moment came, if the moment came, she would feel something large. Pride, maybe, or the specific satisfaction of a person who builds something difficult and sees it work. She had been prepared for those feelings. What she actually felt, watching the sensor feeds, was tired. Not the tired of exhaustion, the tired of completion, the tired of a weight that has been carried for so long that the person carrying it has stopped noticing it is there, and then sets it down, and notices it for the first time in the setting down. 9 years. The missed wedding. The hours. The classified phone logs. The versions of herself she had presented to people who loved her that were true in all the ways that she was allowed to let them be true, and silent about the rest. Her colleague Warren Diaz was standing beside her, watching the same feeds. Warren had been on the team for 6 years. He had built the 3rd and 4th generation platform guidance systems, which were the part that made the platforms capable of remaining completely dark for over a decade without drift or degradation. He was a quiet person in general, and he was very quiet now. "They are holding," he said, watching the feed. The Velthari fleet had not moved since the channel to their flagship closed. "They're actually holding." "Of course they are," Lena said. Warren looked at her. "You're not going to feel anything about this, are you?" She thought about it. "I feel something. I just don't know what to call it yet." "I want to call it winning," he said. "It isn't winning," Lena said. "Winning is when the other side loses. This is something different." She watched the sensor feeds. The contacts were still there. The Velthari fleet was still there. The 400,000 people on the colonial worlds were still going about their mornings in the thin, particular light of their various suns. This is when the other side learns that they were wrong, and they have to live with that, and so do we. Warren considered that. "Is that better than winning?" "I think so," Lena said. "I'm not completely sure. Ask me in a year." On Kepler 4, a colonial world that had been settled 22 years ago by a mix of farming families from the American Midwest and a smaller group of engineers and teachers who had wanted a different kind of horizon, a woman named Sandra Cole was hanging laundry on a line behind her house when the sky did something strange. She was 53 years old. She had lived on Kepler 4 for 19 of those years. She knew the sky on this world the way a person knew the face of someone they had looked at every day for 2 decades. Its particular colors, its weather patterns, the way the clouds came in from the southwest in summer and the north in winter, the specific quality of the light at different times of day, which was not quite like Earth's light, but which he had long since stopped comparing to Earth's light because it was simply the light of home. What the sky did was nothing she had a name for. In the upper atmosphere, very high up, there were things moving. She could not make out their shapes. They were not aircraft she recognized. They were moving too fast for the commercial transit vessels that came through the port in the colony's main settlement twice a week. They were not moving like anything she had seen in 19 years of looking at this sky. She stood with a sheet in her hands and watched for a long moment. Then she went inside and turned on the household communication panel and found the Colonial Information Channel, which normally broadcast weather reports and crop market prices and the occasional notice about road maintenance in the outer settlements. The channel was playing music, not the recorded public information music that played between announcements, but something else, a classical piece, strings, and something lower underneath them, the kind of music that sounded like it had been chosen deliberately for a moment that needed a specific kind of sound. Sandra listened to the music for a little while. Then she went back outside and looked at the sky again. The things moving through the upper atmosphere were gone now, or too high to see. The sky was the sky she knew, its colors and its light, and the laundry moved in the morning wind the way it always did. She finished hanging the laundry. Later she would read the full account in the Colonial News Service and understand what she had seen. Later she would think about those 19 years and the way Earth had always sent the supply ships on time and the medical teams when they were needed, in the quiet, reliable presence of a home world that felt far away and close at the same time. She would think about what it meant that the people who sent those things had also been building quietly and without announcement, the things she had seen moving through her sky this morning. But that was later. Right now she finished the laundry and went in to make breakfast for her husband, who was still asleep, and for her daughter, who was not. The Velthari fleet began to withdraw at the 3rd hour. It was not a fast withdrawal. Fast withdrawals were for emergencies, for situations where speed was necessary because delay created additional danger. There was no emergency here. Nothing had fired on the Velthari fleet. Nothing had moved to intercept it. The 312 platforms were still at their stations, and the deep space contacts were still holding, and the human patrol vessels around Kepler 7 had still not moved from their original positions. Dorvac ordered the withdrawal at a speed that was consistent with controlled, professional disengagement. He gave the orders in a steady voice, and he watched his formation begin to tane, and he did not speak again for several minutes. His bridge crew worked. They were good people, all of them, trained and competent and doing their jobs with the focus that good training produced. Nobody said anything that was not operationally necessary. Nobody looked at him with anything other than the appropriate professional attention of crew awaiting orders. He appreciated that more than he could express and did not try to express it. Vren, at the sensor station, continued reading the contacts in a flat voice. The platforms were not following. The deep space vessels were not following. As the Velthari fleet moved back across the boundary it had crossed 3 hours ago, the sensor returns from human assets remained constant and unchanged. Present. Visible. Not pursuing. This, Dorvac thought, was itself a message. Pursuit would have been aggressive. Pursuit would have been a demonstration of capability for its own sake, the kind of action that said we are showing you what we can do because we want you to fear it. Not pursuing said something more specific. It said, we have no interest in you unless you give us one. It said, this is not about dominance. It said the thing Grace Owens had said directly, which was that 31 years of restraint had not been the absence of capability but the presence of something more considered than capability alone. He thought about that for a long time as the fleet moved. He thought about 31 years of Accord sessions where the human delegation had sat quietly in their box and smiled at the diplomatic receptions and brought the food and sent the medical teams and said the right things in the trade tongue and given no indication of anything other than the pleasant, simple enthusiasm that his chancellor had described from the chamber floor. He thought about the intelligence assessments he had read before this operation, each one thorough, each one well-sourced, each one completely wrong in the way that a measurement is wrong when the thing being measured has decided what it will allow the measuring instrument to find. He was an intelligent officer. He had known, in an abstract way, that intelligence assessments were only as good as the information available to the people who wrote them. He had known that an adversary could shape its visible profile. He had factored those possibilities into his thinking before many operations. He had not factored them in here because the available information had been so consistent over such a long period of time that the consistency itself had become evidence. 31 years of the same picture had made the picture feel like ground truth. He understood now, at a level that was not abstract at all but had the specific weight of a lesson learned at real cost, that 31 years of a consistent picture was not evidence that the picture was true. It was evidence that the picture was being maintained. Sir, Sarek said, we have cleared the boundary. Thank you, Dorvac said. And then, because it was relevant and he was a precise officer, update our position in the navigation log and file the standard boundary transit report with the Accord Traffic Authority. Standard report, sir? Not standard, Dorvac said. We transited the boundary twice. Once inward, once outward. That is what the report will say. Sarek entered the report. Dorvac looked at the sensor returns one more time before he ordered them cleared from the primary display. The human contacts were still there, still visible, not following and not threatening and not doing anything other than existing in the space they had always occupied, waiting for the moment they had been waiting for with a patience he was only now beginning to measure correctly. He ordered the display cleared. He ordered the fleet to standard transit formation for the journey home. He sat in his command chair and thought about the conversation that waited for him at the end of that journey, which was not going to be easy and which he was going to have anyway, because he was a Kepler officer and Kepler officers did not deliver incomplete reports. Senator Paul Whitman received the withdrawal confirmation in his Geneva office at a time in the afternoon when the gray sky had softened slightly and the rain had stopped and the lake in the distance was doing something complicated with the light. He read the confirmation twice. Then he sat with it for a few minutes without doing anything in particular, which was unusual for him because he was a person who generally moved from one action to the next without significant pauses. His aide, a young man named Chris Barker, knocked and opened the door. "The press office is asking if there will be a statement today, Senator." "Tell them yes," Paul said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. And the content?" Paul thought about that. He thought about the underground corridor in Colorado, and the display table with the numbers on it, and Grace Owen sitting across from him for 3 hours explaining 31 years of things he had not known. He thought about what it meant that the people who had known had carried it that long, and why they had, and whether he understood the why well enough yet to put it into the right words. "I will write it tonight," he said. "It will be short." Chris nodded and closed the door. Paul stood up and walked to the window and looked at the lake. The light on the water was the kind of complicated that made it worth looking at for a while. He thought about 400,000 people on 8 colonial worlds who had been in the path of something today and had not known it and were now going about their afternoons without knowing what had passed overhead. And he thought about whether they deserved to know, and he thought about how you told people something like this and what words you used and whether the words existed yet or whether this was the kind of thing that needed new words. He decided the statement would say what was true and nothing more than what was true, and that it would be spoken plainly in the way that plain speech was sometimes the only appropriate response to a situation that contained too much to reduce to anything complicated. 2 days after the Velthari fleet completed its withdrawal, the Accord Council called an emergency session. Grace Owens flew to Vera Station on a standard diplomatic transport. She packed her dress uniform, her leather notebook, and a change of clothes for the return journey. She did not bring aides. Paul Whitman was already on the station when she arrived, and they walked together to the chamber without speaking much, which was a way they had learned to travel together over the past 2 days. Present, elate, not filling the air with words that were not necessary. The chamber was different from the last time she had been in it. She could not have said precisely what was different, because the seats were the same and the lighting was the same and the delegations were in their same sections and the air processes were still running too hot for a human nose. But something in the quality of a room's attention had changed. The way that a room changes when the people in it have had 2 days to think about a piece of information and arrive at a different place than where they started. The Sephira Collective delegate, the tall, blue-skinned female who had not laughed at the 60-second sessions joke and had watched the human box with an expression Grace had not been able to read, was in her seat in the upper gallery. She was watching Grace now, too. The expression was still not something Grace had a clean name for, but it was clearer now than it had been. It was recognition, the specific look of a person who has been watching something for a long time and has just had the thing they suspected confirmed. Grace nodded to her slightly. The Sephira delegate nodded back. The session opened. The presiding officer gave the procedural opening, which was standard and short. Then Paul Whitman stood at the floor podium and delivered the human statement, which he had written the previous night in his Geneva office and which was, as he had told his aide, short. It said that humanity had come to the Accord 31 years ago with genuine good faith and had practiced that good faith in everything it had done since. It said that 2 days ago, the Velthari Empire had moved a war fleet into human colonial space in pursuit of a territorial claim that had been constructed as a pretext rather than a legitimate dispute, and that humanity had responded to that action. It said that no weapons had been fired and no lives had been lost, and the 400,000 people in the Kepler frontier systems were safe and unharmed and had been safe and unharmed throughout. It said that humanity remained committed to the Accord, to cooperative development, to the shared project of building a galaxy where small civilizations could exist without fear of large ones. It said, in its final sentence, that humanity's preference for cooperation was a choice that humanity made freely, and that the freedom to make it was not a theoretical condition but a demonstrated one. Then Paul sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Sethra delegate in the upper gallery began to clap. The sound was clean and clear in the room's acoustics, and it took a few seconds before others joined. When they did, it was not the quick, perfunctory applause of political obligation. It was slower and more considered, the kind of applause that meant something specific to the people doing it, though what it meant exactly varied from delegate to delegate. Grace, in the human delegation box, did not applaud. She was making a note in her leather notebook. Paul, beside her, glanced over and saw what she was writing, and something in his expression shifted towards something that was not quite a smile but was close to it. She was writing, "Now it begins." Not the end, not a conclusion, a beginning, because 31 years of quiet preparation had produced one moment of visible truth, and visible truth was not an ending. It was a new kind of starting point. The conversations that needed to happen had not happened yet. The relationships that needed to change had not changed yet. The work of being known, rather than being underestimated or feared, was different work from the work of staying hidden, and she had not done that work yet. And she realized as she capped the pen, genuinely ready to do it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the weeks after the Kepler Frontier incident, 3 things happened that Grace noted in her log but did not discuss publicly. The first was that the Velthari Empire filed an Article 9 withdrawal with the Accord Arbitration Office on the 28th day, 2 days before the deadline she had given Dorvacan. She did not bring the communications to the council floor. She entered a receipt acknowledgement in the appropriate file and closed the matter. The second was that the Sethra Collective Senior Diplomatic Office sent a formal request for a bilateral meeting with Earth's Diplomatic Corps. The request was quiet and properly formatted and said only that the collective believed there were areas of mutual interest that had not yet been explored and that they would welcome the opportunity to explore them. Grace forwarded the request to Paul's office with a single note attached. "Take this one." The third was that Dr. Lena Ferris submitted a formal request for leave from the Applied Research Division. 30 days. The request cited personal reasons, which was an acceptable category under the facility's personnel policies and which did not require elaboration. Grace approved it the same day it arrived, without elaboration, because she understood what 30 days of personal reasons meant to a person who had spent 9 years building things in a mountain. She thought about the long quiet on the day she approved the leave. She thought about what it had cost the people who kept it, not in any dramatic sense, not in the way of great sacrifice that came with obvious weight, but in the accumulated small way of years of living alongside something large and unspeakable, of carrying a knowledge that shaped everything and could be shared with almost no one. They had carried it because it needed carrying. They had carried it because the alternative was not carrying it, and not carrying it meant letting the galaxy know what humanity had built before humanity understood the galaxy well enough to know how that information would be received. 31 years had not felt like 31 years while they were happening. They had felt like the ordinary length of a career, of a life, of a series of Tuesday mornings and Accord sessions and budget reviews and very long elevator rides down into places that were cold and clean and smelled of recycled ozone. She had never once considered stopping. She had never thought, "This is too long. This is too much. I cannot keep holding this." But she understood now, sitting in her office at Earth Defense Command on a quiet afternoon with a withdrawal confirmation filed and the Sethra meeting request forwarded and Lena's leave approved, that the weight had been real even when it was invisible. That invisible weight was still weight. That 31 years of choosing restraint had cost something, quietly, in the way that all real choices cost something. The cost had been worth it. She believed that without reservation. But she was glad it was over. She closed her notebook. She stood up. She walked to the window of her office, which looked out of the mountains, and she stood there for a few minutes and did something she had not done in a very long time during working hours. Nothing in particular. The mountains were the same as they always were. The sky above them was clear and very blue, The kind of blue that had no name precise enough for what it actually was, and she looked at it until she felt the thing inside her that had been wound tight for 31 years ease by one small degree. Not all the way. She was too experienced to expect all the way. But 1 degree, in the right direction, was enough for a Tuesday afternoon. She turned from the window and went back to her desk and opened the file on the Sethra bilateral meeting request and began to read the background materials, because there was work to do, and she had always been very good at work. And this kind of work, the open kind, the kind that did not require concealment, she was finding, something she had been looking forward to for a very long time.